Well, Shabbat Shalom. Good Shabbos, everyone. So as I mentioned earlier, that today is a special Shabbat called Shabbat Hagadol, the Great Shabbat, which ushers in the week of Passover. And so we had a couple readings related to Passover. The most particular one, which you might not realize, is the reading from Malachi, which mentions that before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord, the ushering in of the Messianic age, that God would send Elijah the prophet, right? And why is that relevant? Is because Elijah the prophet, during our Passover seders, we welcome Elijah, right? With the singing of Eliyahu Hanavi, right? And why do we do that? Because the whole idea is that both in the Tanakh and in Jewish tradition, as well as in the New Testament, is that Elijah is the forerunner of Messiah, right? Because in that song, when we sing in the traditional singing of Eliyahu, we say, Bimheira v'amenu yavo elenu im Mashiach ben David. Come speedily and soon with Messiah, the son of David, right? And the reason why the Christian ordering of, because as you all know, the Tanakh, the same books of the Christian New Testament are the same books in the Tanakh, like in the Jewish Bible. They're just in a different order. And the reason for that is they're meant to give a different overarching narrative. The overarching narrative tells a different story. The reason why the Christian canon ends with Malachi, in that you say these words that we read today, behold, I will send you the prophet before the great and coming and awesome day of the Lord, is because then you flip over into the New Testament and it tells us that John the Immerser, John the Baptist, came in the spirit and power of Elijah. He is the fulfillment of that promise. However, when the Messiah returns, it will not just be someone in the spirit and power of Elijah, it will be Elijah himself who will usher in the Messianic age, right? And so with Passover is called Zaman Cherutenu, the time of our redemption. And the redemption that we long for is not just something that God did for us in the past, but is something that God is going to do for us in the future, right? And that is the redemption of the Messianic redemption, the redemption that is ushered in by the Messiah. So Passover recounts God's deliverance of us, the Jewish people, from Egypt approximately 3,300 years ago. And this is why it's called Zaman Cherutenu, the time of our redemption. And Passover has remained a distinct identity marker of the Jewish people throughout years of dispersion and turmoil, and remains one of the most widely observed Jewish practices to this day. More Jews, even Jews who are secular, will do something for Passover than they will even attend a high holiday service, right? It really is one of the most, it's one of the primary identity markers of the Jewish people. God commanded us, of course, to eat matzah, the bread of affliction, for 7 days, because chametz represents sin, right? Those things in our lives which puff us up. Israel, we know, was supposed to offer a Passover sacrifice, a yearling male, lamb or goat without defect. And the lamb was to be taken into the home for a few days prior to its slaughtering and treated as a loved member of the family until it was sacrificed. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. During this covenant commemorative meal, called the seder, the lamb was to be eaten along with matzah and maror, with bitter herbs. And the Passover week, as we've also discussed so far, actually contains 3 separate yet connected holidays. What are those 3 separate yet connected holidays in the week of Passover? What is the first one? The first night? Pesach, right? Passover. And in the diaspora outside of the land of Israel, it's the first 2 days, right? So in the diaspora, we have 2 days of a seder. And then the rest of the days of Passover, the 7 or 8 days in the diaspora, what is that? Right. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, Chag HaMatzot. And then, in the middle of this is another holiday, which nowadays in Judaism doesn't really carry as much weight anymore, and nobody really observes it, to my knowledge. Outside of the land of Israel, there might be a handful of people who do it, but for the Messianic Jewish community, it's very significant. And what is that? Right, the Feast of First Fruits, Yom HaBikurim. And this year is one of the, every so many years, Yom HaBikurim and Easter fall on the same day. So not only are we celebrating the resurrection of our Messiah on the day that he rose, on the actual day, Yom HaBikurim, which I'm going to talk more about next Shabbat, because it'll be much more relevant when the resurrection day is the next day. But we're doing this along with other believers in Yeshua throughout the world, which I always find, significant. It's always significant to celebrate the resurrection of our Messiah, but it's wonderful when we get to do so, not only in the spirit with other believers in Yeshua, but on the actual day. David mentioned earlier that the Torah tells us in the book of Deuteronomy, and remember, what is so significant about Deuteronomy is it's not the generation that experienced the redemption from Egypt. It is the children and grandchildren. And there are multiple times in the book of Deuteronomy that God tells us, when you celebrate Passover, you're supposed to say, like when your child asks you, what is the reason why we do these things? By the way, the 4 children, the 4 children in the Haggadah, comes from 4 places in the Torah when a child actually asks a question about Passover, right? And one of those questions is, what is the purpose of this holiday? And you're supposed to say, the Torah tells us, when God delivered me from Egypt, right? And David did a good job of talking about, why are you supposed to say when God delivered me? And the answer is because it's one of these mystical times, kind of with the giving of the Torah, when it says that every generation stood at Mount Sinai. The same thing happens with the deliverance from Egypt. Every Jew was delivered from Egypt. Because Egypt is not just a physical place, it's a spiritual place. It's the central event that turned a band of slaves into a nation. The Exodus is really, even though the Jewish people existed, the Israelites existed, this was really the birthing of the Jewish people as we know it today. And it informs the central concept of salvation and redemption in Jewish theology. We're supposed to say, when God delivered me, because Mitzrayim is not just a place on a map. It is a condition that we find ourselves in. And every single year, there is something that we need to be delivered from. Pesach, of course, as did all the biblical festivals, played an enormous role within the life of Yeshua and his followers. There are over 28 references to the observance of Passover within the New Testament alone. Since the time of Yeshua, a whole order of service had been developed surrounding the seder, adding further traditions and customs to the biblical command to eat lamb along with matzah and maror. As many of us are already aware, the seder is the context for Yeshua's last covenant meal, often called the Last Supper, that he had with his disciples. The Passover meal brings out the context and understanding of the covenant meal Yeshua shared. And within the parallels to the crucifixion and the order and preparation of the Passover lamb, we can better appreciate the atonement that Yeshua made on our behalf through his death, burial, and resurrection. And what's fascinating is the crucifixion lines up perfectly with the preparation and sacrifice of the Passover lamb. It's truly remarkable. And for those of you who are not familiar with this, many of you have heard this many, many, many times, but for those who haven't, here's just a few of the parallels. First, the lamb was to be prepared and segregated. The lamb was to be the best of the flock. All the lambs were to be paraded into Jerusalem with the waving of palm fronds and the singing of Hosanna, of God save us. The lamb was tied to the altar by its upper and lower legs, right? And caused to lay for an extended period of time. And when the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, brought down the knife to take the life from the lamb, he would pronounce, "It is finished." And when the lamb was roasted, it was done, as we know, on a cross, if you will. One piece would go through the whole body of the lamb on the spit. And remember, because you had to roast it whole, how would you do that at a time when anybody who knows anything about hunting or preparing animals and stuff knows that you can't actually prepare an animal with all of its intestines and everything inside of it. Otherwise, what happens when you heat it up? All that stuff blows up. And it'll contaminate the meat. But you're supposed to roast it whole. So what do? So first of all, they would have a spit that would go through the entire thing. And then you would have another cross piece that would hold the chest cavity open. And then they would take the entrails and wrap it around the head of the lamb or the goat. So this is the bloody, sort of crown that the lamb would, or the goat would wear as it's being roasted, because you had to cook it whole. But how do you cook it whole without ruining the meat? Well, you would do that by kind of taking the entrails out, wrapping it around the head and the upper part of the spit, and that so that it's all being cooked together, yet not in a way that's going to contaminate the meat. And the blood of the lamb during the first Exodus provided redemption for the firstborn of Israel when applied to the doorposts, also in the shape of a cross, right? Above the door on the sides, and it would drip down on the bottom. And so even from that first Exodus, this was a sign of redemption. And I hope this begins to sound familiar, right? I'm not going to go in and give you the parallels exactly, but I gave you like some specifics that if you see what's going on here, it should all sound familiar. The biblical text is clear that we can never atone for ourselves. And that was the role of the sacrificial system, to make atonement for our shortcomings. And specifically for the Passover sacrifice, the blood of the Passover lamb was placed on the doorpost, which caused death to pass over the homes of the Israelites. Through the sacrifice of Yeshua, death in our lives is passed over once and for all. A lot of Christians make the mistake of assuming, because you hear pastors talk about this all the time, that the Passover sacrifice was an atoning sacrifice. It wasn't. It's not an atonement sacrifice. It's a holiday. It's one of the festival sacrifices, but it's a unique one. But it's related to the idea of atonement. The sacrifice of lamb doesn't cleanse you from sin. Right? It's a command that we're supposed to do in symbolic of what God did for us during the time of the original Passover, when God did pass over our homes. But it alone doesn't grant atonement. You need other sacrifices for that during Passover. Instead, what this does is it's connected to the idea of atonement, because death passed over us. Right? It didn't touch us. And for those Israelites, though, who didn't put the blood on their doorposts, they didn't get off so well. Because everyone, in order to be saved, had to do this. So why do we continue to celebrate Passover? There's all kinds of reasons, but we'll look at just a few really quick. Number one is that Passover is our celebration of redemption. It not only shows us back to what God did when he saved us then, it points forward to where God is going to save us in the future. It is also one of God's regalim, the appointed festivals, that we read throughout the Torah, especially in Leviticus 23, where God commands that we appear before him on these appointed days. Our sages teach us that in every generation we should celebrate Passover as though we ourselves are personally being delivered from Egypt. As I mentioned earlier, because within Jewish tradition, Mitzrayim, the word for Egypt, is related to all kinds of other words, but one of the ones the rabbis like to point out a lot is the word Metzorim, which means boundaries or limitations. As such, to be redeemed from Egypt is to be overcome and to be redeemed from those natural limitations that impede the realization of our fullest potential. Passover really is our opportunity for redemption. One of the most powerful seders I ever experienced was while I was living and working in Budapest, Hungary. I had just an amazing opportunity to participate in a seder with a large group of Holocaust survivors. And this special group opened my eyes to kind of a deeper message of freedom and redemption. Sitting with Jewish people who had experienced one of the worst atrocities in history, and to see how excited they were to be at this seder was encouraging. For some, it was their first seder since they were children, and for a few of them, it might even have been their last. Yet to experience and celebrate with them not only our liberation from Egypt, but their deliverance from the Holocaust made the message of redemption at this season even more real, right? Because especially as a kid, you don't think about the deeper dimensions of these things. And I remember, not that I didn't think that there was something relevant about Passover at this time, but as a young 20-something, celebrating Passover with them really added a different dimension to what I thought about what it means to be redeemed from oppression and suffering. This festival of freedom, this Passover is one all of us can benefit from. It is our season to be delivered from the limitations within our lives. It really is Zaman Cherutenu, the time of our redemption, if we will let it. It's our season of freedom. Freedom to think beyond ourselves, to not take who we are and what we have for granted. It's freedom to think on a larger scale and have a bigger vision for what God wants to do in our lives and within our congregation. God is only as limited as we want to make God in our lives. We need to be encouraged in this Passover season, for redemption draws nigh. I don't know about you, but I think there's so much going on in the world that when we are preparing for Passover this year, that we really need to be diligent about also preparing ourselves. To not just rid our homes of chametz, but to rid our souls of chametz as well. Right? Those things within our lives that are just holding us back from what we've been called to and our purpose that God has for us. There is so much chametz in the world right now, especially rising anti-Semitism. And may this Passover not only be a reminder of God's redemption, but a reminder of what God can redeem us today as well. Are you ready for redemption? I know I am. Are you ready to be redeemed this Passover season? Then let's get rid of the chametz within our lives and celebrate Passover in preparation for the marriage supper of the Lamb. Chag Pesach Sameach. I wish you and your family and your loved ones a wonderful and joyous Passover season. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father and our King. Ribbono Shel Olam, Master of the universe, we come before you as we are now just days away from the beginning of Passover. And there's so much here that reminds us of not only your redemption of us in the past, not only with the original Passover, but God, your Yeshua, your redemption that happened also during Passover. And the connections that the resurrection provides for us for understanding Passover even more deeply. And as hints and pointers to the redemption that will happen in the future. God, I pray that we will take Passover very seriously and not just see it as a tradition or another holiday, but really understand a dimension that speaks to the deepest recesses of our souls, God. Speak to us, enliven us, put your ruach, your spirit within us, so that we can do the work of the kingdom. We pray this in your name, in the name of Yeshua. Amen.